I know it doesn't mean much to you guys, but this is probably going to be the hardest video that I have ever made. With that being said, I'm not sure if this is going to be as lighthearted or funny or irreverent as a lot of my videos are, so bear with me. If you want to hear this story, unfortunately, you'll just have to deal with that. Hello, welcome back to my story. If you did not know, my name is Harley Nouveau, and the purpose of this channel is to document my journey towards my North Star, while hopefully helping you find yours along the way. So if that sounds like the place for you, then subscribe to my channel and add your name to the storybook that is my life. In today's chapter, we have part 2 of our loved theme episodes of beauty and the tea. I'm not going to be drinking out of this again, not because of my lipstick, but just because I'm sure I'm going to be too distracted, so I apologize in advance. As I said, this is the second part of my episodes on love. That means this follow-up is going to be breaking down and recapping my own personal experiences with love through my life, specifically romantic love. And as such, there are some dark turns on this road ahead. With all of that disclaimer out of the way, let's get into this. In my life, off the top of my head, I would say that there are 3 loves that I've had to varying intensities. I'm gonna go in order to the one with the least depth to the one that was the most consuming. I have changed the names of all individuals involved for the sake of privacy, and also just I feel like that is the right thing to do when you're recapping stories about yourself and individuals that you know, and you don't have any way of contacting them to see if they're okay with being name dropped. It's just a personal opinion of mine. Adults have this sort of condescending rapport with their children, or with children in general. I'm sure a lot of that comes with this idea that until you have more life experience, you don't really understand more complicated concepts past the juvenile ones of like friendship, playing, trust, things like that. As such, you know, something I've heard echoed throughout my entire life by adults, especially my childhood, was, you are only insert age here, you don't really understand what love is. And as somebody who is now well into their 20s, my understanding of love really has not changed that much, apart from the dynamic of loving myself. So keep that in mind as well. I met River whenever I was a freshman in college. I was really close friends with this girl, and as such, I became acquainted with everyone that she knows. She kind of brought me into her circle. This is that roommate I talked previously about that I was friends with prior to meeting my best friend now, Kamani, Jasmine. And she introduced me one day to this boy named River. And I thought he was cute at first, I'm not gonna lie. He was very serious, and he was a little bit younger than us, so a tad immature. He had this group of 3 other boys that he hung out with, and he was everywhere. And I think it was because he didn't have a lot of connections, because he was from Puerto Rico. So when he came to Texas, it was hard for him to bond with people. And when he latched on to my friend, who I will call Chelsea for the sake of this video, when he latched onto her, that meant that he went everywhere that she went. And since she was always with me, I was always with him too. We got close over time. I obviously thought he was attractive, but I didn't develop feelings for him off of the bat. I think it was one of those situations of, you spend so much time with somebody and you get to know them so well that this bond just forms. And a lot of people always commented on the dynamics that we had, that in a way we were kind of like a throuple or a love triangle of sorts, because like they were friends with benefits, Chelsea and River, so they were sexually active. And then I was kind of the emotional point of the triangle. So a lot of people said that it was like more like we were dating and then they were just sleeping together. And as I spent time with him, he taught me a lot. I mean, he was a practicing Muslim, which was strange because I hadn't really ever had a close relationship with anyone that was a member of that faith. But he was more Americanized, so keep that in mind. English was his second language. He was just so different from me. And I think that I liked that because I've always been a fan of experiencing new things. Not that he was, just an experience, but I think that attracted me to him, as well as his sense of confidence. He was a very confident person. Over time, him and I became just as close as Chelsea and I did, and I would consider him my male best friend. And as we progressed through college, there became this tension of sorts between Chelsea and I when it came to River, because I think that she had a bit of a jealousy issue about our dynamic, because we were more emotionally close. I mean, like, I would spend the night with him, he would spend the night with me, we hung out all the time, even when she wasn't there. And I really don't think that she liked that. Things became strained, and she started kind of intervening in our dynamic. So she started going out of her way to kind of prevent us from spending time with each other. And things happened, I'm not going to go into them, that made me feel like he might have felt similarly to me, but he was a little bit scared to act on it. So there was this part of me that thought there was the potential for a relationship there, if given the opportunity to blossom. However, if you haven't heard the story of how my friendship with Chelsea ended, you can check that out in one of the various videos of Jasmine that I have. I don't know which one specifically, but we've talked about it before. When my friendship with Chelsea fell apart, she was very controlling over me, but also over him. She had access to all of his social media. He didn't have a car, so she was kind of like his lifeline to doing anything apart from just staying at home. And he was enlisting into the army, and you'll see this theme is going to reoccur. He was enlisting into the army, and he was going to be leaving shortly after my falling out with Chelsea. The day that the whole row happened, everything was cool with him. Nothing had shifted. We were still really close. And then suddenly, the next day, it was like he didn't even exist. I'd never heard from him. I'd never seen him. I couldn't contact him through phone or social media. I suspect that Chelsea had a hand in that, because I know that she monitored his social media through his login. I suspect that she probably blocked me, and he was so oblivious to things like that that he probably thought when I cut off her, I cut him off too. At least that's what I tell myself, because I would like to think that if I didn't do anything to him, and because we were really emotionally close, that he wouldn't just drop me like a bad habit the moment my friendship with her fell apart. But people are tricky like that, you know? I never saw or heard from him again when River left to the army, or even since then, and it's been years now. I find myself wondering how he's doing, wondering if he ever thinks about me, and that left me with a lot of trust issues when it came to boys. That and some other stories that you're about to hear. And a bit of a complex, especially when it comes to my friendship with men, because even though I did, in retrospect, I think, love River, I think I was in love with River a bit, he was still my friend, first and foremost. So that relationship ended in heartbreak on my part and a lot of melancholy. The second love that I am going to talk about was Chase. Chase and I didn't necessarily grow up together per se. I was well into elementary school when I met him. He was quite a bit older than me by like maybe 4 or 5 years, because he was the eldest son of a family that my family became friends with. And from the bat, him and I kind of bonded really closely. Of course I was little, I followed him around everywhere. Whenever our families were connected, I was like attached to his hip, and vice versa. And he opened up a lot more to me than he did almost every other person in his life, including girlfriends that he had. Hence you see this reoccurring theme of having feelings for straight men. But again, these feelings weren't really unrequited, and I was led to believe as we got older that he felt the same way. Some of the things that happened between us were not what would typically happen between two friends that there was no connection between. And his mother, who was like a second parent to me, always pushed this narrative that him and I were, in a way, soulmates. They always talked about how I was the most important relationship in his life. and how I kind of superseded his connection with girlfriends, siblings, anybody. It was like we completed each other in a way. I really found myself, as I struggled with this sense of belonging and loneliness, latching on to that idea and holding on to it. I mean, in the words of Grey's Anatomy, I was really Chase's person. When anything bad would happen, he would call me, he'd cry on the phone, I would console him. We shared rooms all the time. Like, it was a very special connection that I really have never had with anybody before. But when I went off to college, everything kind of shifted, and I don't know if it's because I was more independent, I was farther away, I became a different person, and in turn, our dynamic became a lot more strained. We didn't talk to each other as much, and I think that he started to kind of venture out into different territories to kind of make up for that lack of intimacy that was there. And vice versa. I have been pretty open about the fact that when I was in college, I was a bit of a hoe, so what can you do? When I returned from college for visits, I always stayed with him, shared the same room, bonded even more, including some activities that were a bit scandalous. And yeah, I kind of felt like when I got done with college, he was always really going to be there for me. And when I moved back to where I grew up permanently, I went to go live with him again. And there was definitely a shift, because at this point, and I'm going to be honest, I was not happy about it. He had met a girl, they had settled down, they were engaged and had a baby. And I was very hurt, I understand why, about the fact that for all intents and purposes, I was made to believe that I was the closest thing to like a significant other, not even just romantic, but in period, the closest thing to a second half that Chase had. And I wasn't even part of the wedding, and I was friends with him and his fiance. I was very hurt by that, and when she pushed the topic, it was like he was almost embarrassed to be associated with me, which was a very stark difference from the way that we grew up and the way that he acted in public most of the time. And I should have seen the writing on the wall there, but ultimately, her and I had a falling out over the relationship with Chase and his family. Chase's mom, who I realized was always a bit of a viper in sheep's clothing, really had created a lot of unnecessary drama between all the players on the chessboard. And when the game was over, I had lost. And my friendship with Chase's fiance fell apart, and my relationship with Chase's family fell apart. And I was in a really dark place at that time, and I was really struggling with where I was going in life. And I was really hurt because him and I had been close for 20 years, and he made no effort whatsoever to reach out to me, to see if I was okay, to see if what he had heard from his fiance was true, what had happened. It was like kind of similar to River. He just cut me out of his life. And that really hurt me deeply, because I had always pictured, like, no matter what, there's going to be this one consistent person in my life, and it was going to be him. And granted, I'm sure a lot of that emotional attachment is residual from my childhood, as I talked about in my last video. Familiar love, in a way, rearing its ugly head, and a little bit of obsessive love, because when her and I were talking about their wedding, his fiance, I didn't reveal to her at the time that I wasn't gonna go, because the idea of watching someone who I kind of pictured being a part of my life marrying somebody else didn't sit well with me. And I kept that to myself, of course. A lot of my feelings I never really revealed to people. Maybe I should work on that. So I'm recording this as I edit. I thought it was important to note, I understand for clarity that a lot of these timelines kind of intersect. When I get to the next person and I talk about his untimely death, his death was actually the overall catalyst for why Chase's fiance and I fell out, because when he died, I kind of separated myself from a lot of people to grieve and it was like the straw that broke the camel's back for her because she felt I was emotionally unavailable. I just wanted to make that clear in case it got confusing about how these loves all interacted at the same time in my life. He and I didn't speak for 9 months, and then one day ran into each other at a bar, and he got really drunk. And I drove back with him back to his house because I wanted to make sure he was okay. She wasn't home. Before you think anything happened, it didn't. But I asked him, I confronted him about all this negativity I was feeling over the way the situation had played out and our dynamic, because I wasn't just imagining it. Both him and his mom really made me feel that our dynamic was different than it ended up being. And he told me, essentially, sorry, I keep looking off the distance. I get uncomfortable staring people in the eye, especially cameras. I don't know why. It makes me really emotional. Essentially, he told me that him and his mother always kind of knew I was more of a sensitive, easier target. And the way that it feels whenever you have my undivided attention and love was such a euphoric high that he didn't want to give that up, but he had no intention of ever reciprocating that. And I asked for clarification because I didn't really understand what that meant. And essentially it was that he manipulated me emotionally, kind of tried to pull me apart from people my whole life so that I would become, in a way, codependent on him because he wanted me to love him, but he didn't want to love me. He had used me for 20 years. And I was devastated, you know. I knew that maybe the rose-colored glasses I had on weren't an accurate vision of the world around me, but I never pictured that a relationship that had brought me so much light in my life with multiple people was always so dark at its core. And it messed me up hard. I kind of cut myself off from everybody for a long time because I didn't trust anyone after that. I mean, how can you? The closest person, for the most part, that you had in your entire life reveals that they had stabbed you in the back a long time ago and kept the knife there because it was convenient. And that was how my love for Chase died. The next and final person that I'm going to talk about, and I will expound way more on this later in this channel's life, is Jacob. Jacob and I met when I was in 6th grade, and as you heard in my friendship video, when I moved to middle school, everything in my life changed because people cared about who I was more than they ever had, and I found myself being completely and irrevocably alone. And Jacob was this boy, I always saw him at school, but I never spoke to him. I mean, how could I? He was like popular, everyone wanted to be him or wanted to talk to him or be his friend, and I was the weird gay kid that, you know, slunk around with the rejects of the school, who was a little too artistic and a little too quick to speak his mind. I was walking home from school one day and I met him at a function at an elementary school near where I lived. And I'm gonna be honest with you, I thought that he was a douche. I'm not gonna go too far into like our entire relationship together. This is gonna be a quick summary because I want to dedicate a separate video to that at a later time, but I thought he was a douche. But it set the penchant for my taste for douchey guys. And I kind of let him know how I felt about him and let him know about himself. And I think that that kind of helped us beginning of our friendship because there was a respect there, because not a lot of people stood up to the pinnacles of schoolhouse popularity. You know, they're held on a pedestal that nobody dares ever approach. And I think the fact that I had the audacity to poke the bear kind of made him interested in me more. And as we moved into the next phase of school, because this was about halfway through, I found myself in like every single class with him, and we spent a lot of time together. Privately, of course, because I was still like the weird kid, but we developed a very special bond, and it was this shining beacon of hope in my life, because my life was very dark at the time, and he brought so much meaning and joy to it. Oh my God, please don't cry. He quickly became like the most important person in my life to me. And I'm not gonna lie, I fell in love very quick. They say you don't know what love is at that young of an age, but I can tell you 10 years later, that that was it. I'm not a big believer in the afterlife. I'm not a big believer in soulmates per se, but if soulmates existed, then I considered Jacob to be my soulmate. And I quickly had a hard time visioning a future that he was not a part of. And as the years passed, we ended up getting together secretly, of course, because I lived in an openly homophobic town, and he was struggling with a sense of identity because he had all these expectations from the people around him, socially, from his own family. And I was okay with that because I was just happy to be loved by somebody. We went into high school and the dynamic continued, and I never asked him to come out. Maybe because I was scared. Maybe because I didn't want to jeopardize the relationship that we already had, even if it was a lot of effort. I mean, there was a lot of sneaking around, a lot of talking behind people's back. I mean, virtually nobody knew about this relationship except for a few key people. And when it came time for thinking of the future, we'd always talked about moving to Austin. When it came time to thinking about for the future in college, I knew that there was a very key decision that had to be made because Jacob was very into athletics. He was very into sports. Granted, at this time, we were separated via high school in a lot of ways. So the time that we had together was even more important. But we spent a lot of that time planning a future, and it became very clear to me, maybe because I have a fear of commitment, I don't know, that I didn't picture his dreams aligning with me in a way that made both possible to achieve. And I had no sense of self-worth at the time. I knew that he had these aspirations that he wanted to reach, and because this was before being gay was really accepted on the scale that it is now, not that it's amazing, but you didn't have openly gay athletes, you didn't have openly gay anybody who wasn't ostracized by society. And I knew that I couldn't live the rest of my life in the shadows, and I didn't expect him to make me. But how could I ask somebody that I loved more than anybody to give up their dreams for me? The dreams that they had had since they were a little child, before they even met me. That wasn't fair. And I didn't even give him the option. In hindsight, my biggest regret is not having that conversation with him. Maybe it was because I was scared that the answer I was going to get was, I am picking my dreams over you. But I felt deep down, if given the choice, he was going to pick me instead of his future, and I couldn't let him do that. I didn't think that was fair, and I didn't think that I was worth it. So I chose to remove myself from the equation, and that was truly the unfair part. I gave the other half of a relationship no say in how I chose to handle our relationship. So I left Jacob behind, and I went off to somewhere else, to a different place. And he tried so hard to keep the bond there, to keep the relationship there. And of course I still loved him. I love him to this day. But I was too stubborn, and I didn't think that I was worth it enough to let him put me back into that picture. We kept in contact through the years. Not a lot of people know, because he didn't ever come to visit, because I wouldn't let him come to visit. I didn't want him to stay attached to me, because that would mean that he was putting less emphasis on what he wanted out of life and more emphasis onto me. And you know, the fun thing was, essentially I gave up on our relationship so that he could pursue his dreams of being an athlete, and he didn't even end up being an athlete because he decided that he liked music more, which I should have seen coming, because back in the day he used to send me messages on Skype learning to play guitar, specifically John Mayer, which is why to this day I could not listen to John Mayer. But there was a joy in his eyes whenever he played music, and I should have seen that. But there was a joy in his eyes when it came to a lot of things, including when he looked at me, and that made me feel like I was worth something. We kept in contact for a really long time, and in the back of my mind, regardless of how it had happened, I always pictured getting done with college, him finally coming to terms with who he was and being open, because, you know, he was finding himself in the world, and that was a journey he needed to take without me. But I always pictured, and we talked about at the end of that journey, we were going to be together again, because as I said, we were like two puzzle pieces that just fit together. But my makeup's not waterproof, so I'm trying not to cry. That never got to happen, because in 2017, he died. And I felt it, you know. I say I don't believe in things like that, but I was at work, happened at nighttime, because he was at a party with a bunch of friends on a beach somewhere, and they got a little bit tipsy, and he decided that he wanted to go for a swim, and nobody was really paying attention, and he wasn't really ever a good swimmer. And he drowned. And I was at work, and suddenly, like, everything was normal, and then in a split second, everything changed. And it was like the wind had been knocked out of me. I was struggling to breathe. I was struggling to stand. Nobody knew it was wrong. I didn't even know it was wrong. I just knew that something had happened. And about 30 minutes later, I got a phone call from his brother that indeed something had happened. And it's never really been the same, you know? I wake up every day, even now, 2 years later, 3 years later this year, and I wake up and I think about what he's doing. There's a moment, you know, when you open your eyes and you forget that other person at the end of that tether isn't there anymore. You pull on it and it's just slack. I find myself wanting to see his face again, wanting to hear his voice again, but I never will. And I know that he wouldn't want me struggling so hard after the fact, but it changed everything. I can't go there anymore. I'll never be able to go to Austin ever, because that just, what it represented versus what it represents now. So many things are different, they're duller, they have less meaning. And I find myself constantly comparing people to him. And I don't know if I'm ever really gonna love anyone like that. I don't know if anyone's ever really gonna love me like that again. I wonder what he would feel about the person I've become. Those are the only 3 loves I've really ever had. There've definitely been some potential ones in there. I just struggle now at this point. I struggle with opening myself up to the possibility of being loved by somebody else ever again, whether it be because I was abandoned, I was used, and I was left behind. And those 3 men in my life have really done a lot of damage. 2 of them more purposeful than the other. I would be lying to you if I didn't say I wasn't angry at Jacob, because like, how could he leave me? But that's not fair. You know, he didn't choose to die. So if you're still here, I imagine 30 minutes later, because I've been talking for a while, that's my story. And I'm not going to say it's better to have loved and lost than never loved at all, because there's so many days I question and wish that I hadn't met any of these people, because I wouldn't have been hurt so deeply. But as I've always said, maybe not necessarily there are silver linings in every moment of life, but there are definitely lessons that you can learn. Even how brief we experienced together, I felt important and complete so many times thanks to these people. So that's all I really have for you today. Sorry that this video was so melancholy. Next one won't be as bad, I promise, but that is all that she wrote in this chapter. These loves, unfortunately, weren't able to be a part of my story to the very end, but they played some important parts. And for that, I will always be grateful. As always, I am Harley Nouveau, and I wish each of you every happiness until our stars next align.